Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Classical Academy podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm Shay Ramquist, the producer of the podcast, filling in for our regular host, Dr. Mark Phillips. And I'm filling in today because today's guest is actually none other than Dr. Mark Phillips, our host. Mark is a trained biochemist. He also holds a master's and doctorate in theology and biblical apologetics. He's also got a degree from the University of Oxford. And Mark has worked as an animal surgeon, pastor, missionary, and stand-up comedian. These days, in addition to hosting our podcast, Mark serves as the chair of the Department of Theology and Science here at Trinity Classical Academy. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so glad to be here.
Yeah, how does it feel to be on the other side of the mic?
Well, with you, my trusted producer, I feel like we're on smooth waters with a wind at our back.
All right. Well, let's see what kind of progress we can make. And maybe we're headed into choppy waters because I see here, Mark, that America's fastest growing religion is atheism. And it's fueled mostly by this belief that science contradicts the Bible. That seems like some pretty scary storm clouds on the horizon.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, Mark, you're bringing out a book that addresses the challenge to scientific atheism entitled Scientific Apologetics, Bridging Science and Faith in a Classical Christian Dialogue. You just gave a wonderful Trinity U lecture last month to our community on some of the key findings in our book, and I would urge you, listener, to go and seek out the YouTube video of that. You can watch the whole thing, but for those who couldn't attend, we wanted to give a little recap. So, Mark, first of all, for those who don't know, what does this word mean, apologetics? Does that mean that it's just really good at getting good at making apologies to people? You're just doing so much wrong, you got to say sorry and sorry and sorry.
Right. That's the first thing people think when they hear apologetics. But it's really from the Greek word apologia or apologion, when Peter is writing and saying, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you. In other words, Christianity is a reasonable faith. Well, that Greek word there for reasons, apologia, and that's where we get this idea, the rationality of the faith, that Christianity is not a blind faith. It is a faith. We walk by faith, not by sight, but that doesn't mean we walk blindly. What it means is that we have faith as we walk the Christian walk, but it's based upon reason. And that's why God says, come, let us reason together. He doesn't say, come, close your eyes and be a blind person. He says, come, let us reason together. So it's a rational faith. And apologetics is the presentation of evidence, the presentation of arguments, philosophical, historical, the idea that Christianity is the most reasonable faith and the most fact-based and evidence-supported faith. And that's where apologetics comes from.
Excellent. Okay. So in your lecture, you were highlighting three of these main arguments for the Christian faith. In fact, how a proper understanding of science itself helps us believe in the reasonableness of Christianity. And so those three that you highlighted were the origin of modern science, the origin of the universe, and then the origin of life. So let's take these one by one, if you would. How does the origin of modern science support Christianity? Aren't modern science and Christianity at war? Don't we have to choose between following our head and following our heart here, Mark? What's going on?
Right. That's the common myth. Unfortunately, a widely accepted myth. The whole idea of origins was a connection to foundations.
Oh, yeah.
We can kind of look around at our culture and know something is wrong. It's we know that. I don't have to go into the details, and I won't. I did a little bit in the lecture, but we know something's wrong, and that's because we're losing these Christian foundations. And so when you look at the origins of modern science, you see that it is not only a friend to Christianity, but Christianity itself is the reason we have modern science. Modern science was founded in Christian theological thought. when modern science as we know it today exploded, it exploded in Christianized Europe. And what was happening was these scientists who were starting modern science, it was called natural philosophy at the time, love of wisdom, love of God's wisdom through observation of nature, they were being the theologians. They did have some arguments with the church, but it was not over Scripture. Their challenge to the church was, you church are too married to Aristotelian thought, the Greek ideas of fixed forms. And what I mean by that is there was an idea called necessarian theology. It was necessary for God to create a certain way because he's going to act within these Greek ideas of forms, these perfect forms. For example, a sphere would be the perfect three-dimensional shape, a circle the perfect two-dimensional shape. So one example is that the assumption was the planets, the moon, the stars, they would orbit around each other in perfect circles. Why was this assumption made? Because the circle is the perfect Aristotelian form. Well, these early scientists, these natural philosophers who were all Christians, said, wait a minute, time out. Why are you holding a sovereign God to a fixed, determined way that he should create? He can create however he wants. Here's an idea. Why don't we observe what he did? And then they looked at verses like Jeremiah 33:25, where God's making promises to Israel. And he says, my promises are as reliable as the fixed laws of the universe I've created. Well, this blew the minds of these early natural philosophers. And they said, wait a minute, look at this. There are fixed laws. That's telling us that God, this personal, rational, infinite personal God, has created an intelligible and understandable universe, and it has fixed laws. Why don't we observe what he did and mathematize it? And that's when we started writing these physical laws as we know them today. And we look at the main physical constants. There's 4 main ones and up to 20 to 30 others, and they're all fine-tuned for life on Earth. I know we'll get to that. But the whole idea of science birthed from this breach against necessarian theology. And when the Bishop of Paris finally said, necessarian theology is no good. God is sovereign. He can create however he wants. That was the launching of modern science, which was the natural philosophy based in Christian theology.
Yeah, I love that idea that a better understanding of God and who he really was is what led to this breakthrough, right? Understanding that God is in control. Nothing is limiting him in the way that he's structured the universe. But not only that, that because God is not some sort of chaotic deity who you can never predict one day to the next, like a Zeus or some other kind of, demigod or something like that we see in lots of other literature. But yet he's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and we can count on that in the universe that we see. That there are these laws that we can count on too. We kind of take that for granted, I think, today in Western civilization, but that's not how most people have thought around the world.
No, we take for granted these ideas that the early scientists radicalized. They were radical ideas at the time because, like I said, the church had bought in to Aristotle and to Ptolemy, and they believed in an earth-centered system, not because they saw it in scriptures, but because that was the Aristotelian idea. That was the idea of Ptolemy, and they bought into that. And the early Christian scientists says, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Let's see how God did it. Now, Copernicus used just some strong reason to come up with a sun-centered system, and then later Galileo put some actual math and measurements into this with telescopes and everything. So this idea that I, the Lord, do not change was exciting to them because they knew we could discover these laws that he's talking about, and they would be fixed. They're not going to change. Gravity, fortunately, doesn't change from one day to the next.
Imagine
if it's 10 times stronger and you get up in the morning, you're thrown to the floor. The next minute, it's it's 1/100th of what it was the day before, and you're floating around. It's real fun until a jet runs into you, but then a jet wouldn't be able to fly if the gravity was 1/100th, and on it goes.
Yeah.
The whole world would be absolutely chaotic.
Yeah. And also something that stuck with me in the talk was that to round out a lot of the way that modern science developed was an understanding of human nature as well. Human nature, right, that it was also made in the image of God, and that also gave confidence that we could discover these attributes and elements of nature.
Yes, that was one of four main things.
Yes.
First, that God is sovereign,
Right.
and he doesn't change, so he has fixed laws, and he can create them however he wants. Then humans made in the image of God, they know from the Bible God reveals himself. Well, he reveals himself in nature. So that second part was the imago Dei creature of human beings can learn about this universe he created and see God revealed through it, his primary revelation, of course, being Scripture. Now, the third reason we've already talked about, and that is the laws are fixed, so they're reliable. And then this fourth aspect, however, was the fallen nature of man.
That's so good. Yeah.
And because of that, they knew man had biases and had prejudice and was also prone to innocent error. He may try to fudge the data to fit his theory, or he may just make an error. Either way, humans are fallible, and hence the scientific method was created in order to fight against the prejudice and error of human fallibility. So imago Dei, we can understand the universe. Sinful, fallible nature, we need the scientific method to hold us to a fixed methodology that will keep us from error and bias.
Yeah, I love that way of thinking about even the scientific method as
Yes.
a reflection of the Christian worldview and the Christian
Yes.
view of humanity as both imago Dei, made in God's image, but also fallen, so we better check everybody
Yes.
else's work and check our own.
Right out of Christian theology.
Yeah.
All of it was developed by Christians.
Yeah. One of the points that you brought up, I think that summarizes a bunch of this point about the origin of modern science, not in conflict with Christianity, but obviously, a support and a friend, was this question of why then and why there, right? It's not an
Yes.
accident
Yes.
that modern science emerges out of the Christianized Europe in that time
That's
period.
exactly right.
Right.
That's exactly right. That it was such a great time, and I mean there were little branches that went off here and there, some of the scholasticism and stuff. But overall, it was a movement of rationality based in solid biblical theology, and that is the answer to the question: why then? Why there? Why Christianize Europe? Because it required Christian theology to birth modern science. And science today still operates under these same assumptions. My former supervisor at Vanderbilt was an atheist. And we could work side by side at the lab bench or side by side in the OR doing animal surgery together. We're going to do the same techniques because we're following the scientific method. And we do the same experiment over and over with the same conditions, we're going to get the same result, whether he, the atheist, is doing it, I, the Christian, are doing it. And he is operating under these assumptions. And we had some good discussions about that, and he admitted, yes, that's true, but he didn't want to go any further than that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So that is indeed the foundations of modern science. Without Christian theology, doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's so good, Mark. And I can tell this is just right in your sweet spot, this idea of the connections between science and Christianity. I'm so glad that you get to talk about these things, not only at Trinity lectures, but also every day in our classrooms. But that does take us on to our second point that you brought up in your lecture about the origin of the universe. Why would we think that the origin of the universe from a scientific perspective supports Christianity?
Well, it's fantastic because most Americans may think that the most famous verse in the Bible is John 3:16. Worldwide, almost everyone has heard of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God what? In the beginning, God created everything. God created the heavens and the earth. That's actually the most famous verse throughout the world. And it's a radical statement. Most people may not be aware of how radical this is compared to other ancient literature religious or not. Usually, the creation myths have some kind of already pre-existing deities, some kind of pre-existing stuff. Hinduism goes through this multi-billion-year cycle of the universe, and so you have the Enuma Elish flood and all of these different mythologies. Only the Bible states it very simply, yet very succinctly and clearly. There was a beginning, there was a singular God, and he created everything in the beginning. So this radical statement was originally a challenge to biblical veracity, because the assumption was, well, the universe has always been around. This is what modern science wanted to believe. Now, these early Christian scientists didn't believe that, but they didn't have the tools that 20th century scientists had. And so it was just a subject that really was not dealt with a lot. They were excited about their newfound scientific method, and they started doing all kinds of marvelous investigations into chemistry and biology and physics, and calculus was revealed by Newton, and they were doing some marvelous things, and this idea of the beginning of the universe just was a little bit tabled by science. And then along came the 20th century, when we had the tools to measure this singular, unique statement among Christian scripture only, not the others. And this priest named Lemaitre, Belgian priest, he came up with some pretty good mathematical ideas that demonstrated a beginning to the universe. Well, Einstein looked at some of his math and liked some of it. He rejected the idea that the universe had a beginning, however. But when he developed his own space-time theorems and his theory of relativity, his equations made him conclude that there was an expanding universe. Now, an expanding universe, to an astrophysicist or to a brilliant mind like Einstein, that meant there was a beginning to the universe.
Why?
He didn't like that. Now, the reason is because if it's expanding, then if you go back in time, it contracts. And it's either going to contract to some point where everything appeared, or it's going to contract down into this infinitesimal singularity, and then the millisecond before that, there's nothing. So an expanding universe indicates that there's most likely a beginning. Well, Einstein didn't like this because he had assumed a static universe, one that had always existed. So he created the Einstein cosmological constant to kind of make a breathing universe, one that, yes, it may appear expanding, but then it contracts a little, and maybe expand, maybe it moves, but it's static. It's always been here. And he was fudging his data, is what he was doing.
Einstein.
Yes.
Yeah. And his motivation to do that, it's to stay within what had become the scientific orthodoxy, right?
Yes.
Which is that the universe has always existed, right? Because to admit otherwise would be, at this point, to admit that there's a creator, right? And
yes.
At this point, the scientific orthodoxy had moved away from believing in God. Am I right about that?
That is correct. And Albert was young at the time. So he didn't want to be this young upstart and say, well, I've got these theorems here, and they seem to demonstrate that you've been wrong all this time. Yeah, I'm just this young guy, but that was probably another rationale behind it.
Yeah.
Then Edwin Hubble came along.
Of the Hubble telescope fame?
Yes.
Same
Hubble
guy?
telescope is named after Ed. And just south of here at the Griffith Observatory, what they thought were distant stars when they were looking at pinpricks from the ordinary telescopes, when these big dome telescopes were built, like the one at Griffith, these pinpricks were not distant stars. They were galaxies.
Ooh.
And suddenly the universe was enormous, much bigger than we thought. There were lots of galaxies out there. But even more important was another observation he made. Wherever he looked at the most distant galaxies, there was a shift in the light, and it was shifting red. Now, red is the low end of the visible spectrum. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet.
Yeah.
Violet, the upper end, ultraviolet just above it, infrared heat just below red. And so he said, why is everything shifting to the low end of the spectrum? And of course, he realized this was the Doppler effect of light. As something moves away from you, whether it's sound going or light moving violet, red, as it's moving away from you, it's stretching the wavelengths out, and it's shifting to the red end of the spectrum. And so he realized, I am looking at an expanding universe. The reason these distant galaxies are shifting red is because they're expanding away from my observation point being Earth. By the way, the conditions necessary for life on Earth are also the conditions that allow us to observe the rest of the universe. That's a whole nother lecture. So he invited Al to Mount Wilson, and Dr. Einstein, sure enough, realized his original theorems were correct. He didn't need this fudge factor. And he had to admit that he was wrong to say there was a static universe. And there's this famous quip where he comes out to the press and in that wonderful Jewish German accent of his, I now see the necessity for a beginning. And he saw the necessity. There was indeed a beginning to the universe, and this was a radical shift in thought. And it was fought for a long, long time. Really wasn't until the 60s where the majority of astrophysicists joined this bandwagon to understand it had an origin. Then by the 1990s, it was fully verified, and now everyone knows there was a beginning to the universe, just like Genesis 1:1 says. And so they're working on other ideas, like nothing is actually something, and maybe there really wasn't nothing around. Maybe it was a nothing something nothing, and they're coming up with all kinds of ideas. But it's pretty well accepted now the universe had a beginning, just as the Bible says.
Yeah, and that's so stunning that, it's taken modern science all this time
Yes.
to come all the way back to the start of the Bible, right?
Yes.
And to just realize, what a stunning, statement about reality that is, that the
Yes.
universe had a beginning, and that science now, that is, been demonstrated through these other number of ways.
Yes.
And then the implication,
yeah.
right? What does this mean then?
Yeah.
And
There are
once again,
implications.
yeah.
There are philosophical and theological implications. And there's a wonderful quote, as I'm paraphrasing, goes something like this, and that is that scientists have been scaling the cliff and mountain of knowledge for hundreds of years, and they finally pull themselves up over the peak, and they're getting to the top of knowledge, and they're sitting around a campfire are the theologians who've been waiting on them for hundreds of years. And
Right.
and it's so true. If
Yeah.
science would just accept the Bible, they probably would have started trying to demonstrate a beginning to the universe 200 years ago. And we probably would be way far advanced in telescopic technology by now.
Wow. Yeah, there's this long tradition of seeing or saying that God created two books to reveal himself,
Yes.
right? The book of special revelation, the Bible, and the book of natural revelation, which is just the
Yes.
nature and our ability to understand it. And
Yeah.
that both these point back to the Creator and what he has created.
Well, exactly. In fact, the Belgic Confession, Article 2, actually says that we know God by two revelations, his general revelation of nature and then his primary authority, the revelation of Scripture.
Yeah.
And it states it just plainly and clearly. And he is a God who wants to reveal himself to us. He makes himself obvious because he's trying to draw people unto himself. You
Good.
know.
Well, then, that takes us to our last origin. We've got the origin of modern science in a Christian context, necessarily a Christian discipline. And then we have the origin of the universe being, validated through the
Very well
scientific method,
demonstrated
right?
indeed, yes.
And then finally, the origin of life, right? How does the science around the origin of life point to the truths of Christianity?
Right. Well, it's an indirect way. Origin of life research started exploding in the 1980s when the same explosion in genome science was taking place, that they were understanding how DNA operated. They understood that proteins were coded in the DNA, and proteins are the workhorses of the cell. Probably 90% of the biomolecules are mostly proteins. If you take all the water out of a cell and weigh it, over 50% of that dry weight's going to be proteins. They are the workhorses, the hormones, the transport proteins, the antibodies, and then the enzymes, which catalyze all the biochemical reactions. So proteins are the workhorses, and how you put them together is stored in the DNA. So these were all some obstacles that had to be overcome to explain this idea of a first protocell and then a first cell. And the problem has not gotten any better for the OOL researchers, origin of life researchers. It's gotten much worse because our knowledge of the cell and its complexity has grown enormously in the last 3 decades, especially the last 15 years. As we learn more and more about how the cell operates, the interdependency, the multi-layers of interdependent complexity, it's staggering nanomachinery, absolutely staggering, that is beyond anything humans have ever even comprehended building. Every cell is a multi-dimensional complex factory, and it interacts with other cells. And the more we learn about it, the more difficult the idea that stuff randomly came together to create the first cells. Christians used to be accused of following the God of the gaps. And what that means is these gaps were gaps in scientific knowledge. They would say, well, you Christians, if we don't understand something, you say it's God. Well, obviously, if you're following a God like that, he's going to get smaller and smaller as understanding grows. But what Christians really do is follow the God of the observed science. As the cell knowledge increases, the obvious, interdependent, multi-layered complexity of the cell is becoming more and more obvious. As we learn more about it, God's not getting smaller. He's becoming more obvious in the operation of the very fundamental unit of life, the living cell. And then you put that together into complex organisms like fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and you've got these multicellular organisms with these multi-complex factories operating together in a feedback system. It's off the chart.
Yeah.
It's off the chart.
And this is reacting to this idea that we don't need a creator to have life. We can go from non-life and just some sort of primordial soup and
Right.
just kind of stir that around long enough for millions of years, and suddenly we're going to get life here, right? And this
Exactly.
is saying, like,
Sure.
no, you can stir that soup however long as possible, but it's not going to work, right? I think you pointed out, to have a functioning cell, we need protein and DNA, right?
Yes.
And which one comes first, right? Like, it's kind of a
Exactly.
chicken and an egg situation.
It is.
Tell us
you
about
need
that.
proteins. The code is stored in DNA. It's a 2-strand helix. And the code to build the hundreds of thousands of proteins is stored in there. Well, in order to access that code, you have to unwind the helix. Well, it's a protein machine, many protein machines, really, that unwind the helix, and other protein machines are used to copy that code. Well, those proteins that unwind the helix and those proteins that are used to copy that code are built by codes hidden in DNA. So you can't have those proteins without that code, but you can't access that code without the proteins. And therefore, it's what we teach here at Trinity is circular causality. Which did come first? The answer is neither. They had to both be there from the beginning to have a functional operational cell. And that's just one of the thousands of things going on at any given millisecond within the cell.
Yeah. I once heard an analogy. I wonder if you buy this, the idea that it's more likely that you could have a junkyard sitting around for a million years and a fully functioning F-35 stealth fighter emerge from
Yes.
it than a fully functioning, I don't know, even a fish with all the complexity there.
Sure.
Right. From just, millions of years of,
Right.
whatever else was there before.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you buy that? Does that work?
Oh, sure. It's like you have all the parts of a 747.
Yeah.
Where do they come from in the first place? Okay, we'll give you the parts.
Yeah.
You have all the parts of a 747, throw them into the warehouse, turn on a huge fan for a couple of hours, and you come in and you've built yourself a jet. So even if you have all the right amino acids together and you have all the right stuff together, we've given you one hurdle. Where did that stuff come from? But okay, I'll give you all 20 amino acids. I'll give you a primordial soup, even though there's no evidence that one existed, but I'll give you one. Amino acids are like letters in an alphabet. They have to be put in the right order to build a functional protein. Average protein is 250 to 350 letters long. Now, you take 250 to 350 Scrabble letters and throw them on the floor, you might get a word here and there, but you're not going to get a long sentence of 250 to 350 units with spaces and periods and commas and everything. Yet that's the equivalence of what they're talking about doing with the 20 main amino acids. First of all, you're not going to have them, but even if you do, how are you going to put them together in the right order? And what are you putting them together in the right order in? There's no cell boundary that exists in the first place.
Yeah. Well, this is so good, Mark. And again, I want to urge you, listener, go seek out the YouTube video of the whole talk, and you're going to get this and so much more with depth and wonderful examples and analogies. But Mark, let's bring this home a little bit. Sometimes it's helpful to think through these things, but how should understanding these three origins change the way that we think about God or science or even how we do education?
Yes. Let's go really tender with it. I want you to think about this God who has created like this and ask, why has he made himself so obvious in his creation? And do you see how he's loving you? Do you see how he's calling your name? Do you see how he's drawing you to himself? It's for his glory, but his glory is not some kind of cosmic bully, cosmic egoistic glory. It's a glory of light that draws men and women unto him. And it should change how you view God, because you should realize he's making himself obvious to you. He's calling you to himself. He wants a relationship with you. He's a relational God. All the universe is in relationships. Our objects are drawn to each other through gravity. Protons, electrons are drawn to each other through charges. You see relationships throughout nature because God's a relational being. And he's made himself obvious to draw you unto himself. And the main thing we want for the students here at Trinity is to grow in their awe of God and their worship of God, and to grow in their love of God, to see if he tends to such detail in a single atom, to such detail in the complexity and the interdependent, multi-layered complexity of a cell, how much more is he tending to the details of your life and calling you unto himself? And that's what I hope people will change in their attitude toward him and see, oh, how he loves us.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you, Mark. And thank you, listener, for joining us today on the Classical Academy podcast presented by Trinity U, which is a service of Trinity Classical Academy here in Santa Clarita, California. Our producer is me, Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer and provides our original music. Until next time, let's all continue to grow in wisdom and virtue, and especially in the love of our Creator God. Thank you.